Welcome back to Fly Fishing Hatches Part 13. I'm Raj Kletke. Now that we have the midge flies tied, let's fish some midge hatches. You've probably noticed that I haven't tied any midge larval patterns. This video is on fishing hatches and will dispense with the midge larva right away. Other than perhaps during a behavioral drift situation, I don't consider the larva as being part of a midge hatch. As I said in my simple entomology series, I don't even fish midge larvae, although many fishermen do very successfully, and someday I probably should try them. However, the pupa, single and clustered adults, stillborns, and cripples are commonly involved with hatches, and I'll fish multiple patterns of each. You should too. With other organisms, we attempted to classify the type of hatch and fish it accordingly. So what type of hatch are we fishing with midges? I usually can't, and therefore don't, distinguish between the various types of midge hatches as they commonly occur together. The pre-emergent pupa are rising to the surface, the adults are emerging from the concentrated subsurface pupae, and the egg-laying adults may all be present at the same time. I usually can't tell one midge species from another, even if I could catch them to examine them, and certainly can't tell a just emerged adult from a mature egg-laying adult. So I just fish a midge hatch changing flies as necessary. I do, however, classify midge hatches by my perceived number of organisms present, which we'll talk about shortly. But let's first learn how to recognize a midge hatch. Most commonly, we'll recognize a midge hatch by rising fish on relatively quiet water without seeing an obvious organism. In other words, there are no spinners in the surface. But that doesn't mean midge hatches aren't occurring in faster water or without obvious rising fish. We just can't recognize them. On some water, I may commonly search with a midge pupa as a dropper off a larger nymph or an elk-hair caddis, depending on the depth that I want to fish the midge pupa. I think I'm fishing in a searching mode, but I may actually be fishing what could be considered a low-grade pre-emergence mid-hatch by our current, very generous definition of a hatch that we're using for this video series. A low-grade midge hatch may be almost constant on some rivers, especially tailwaters. The midges may be quite sparse, and there may be virtually no rising fish because the trout are taking the relatively few midges predominantly before they reach the surface, as they are easy targets. Unlike caddis pupa, many of which swim quickly to the surface, midge pupa rise only slowly to the surface, so again they are easy targets. On such rivers as the Bighorn in Montana, if I'm not seeing an obvious hatch, but suspect a low-grade midge hatch, I'll use a beadhead zebra midge or similar, often paired with another midge pupa pattern, or occasionally a tiny pheasant-tail nymph if I'm expecting a blue-winged olive hatch later that day, and I'll try to fish near the bottom or maybe the mid-currents, analogous to fishing a deep searching nymph. Casting and mending your line to achieve a dead drift is very important to success in this setting. When midges are numerous, they will commonly be at all levels in the water column, and trout will readily take them, especially when other organisms are not present, but the trout may also be taking midges even during hatches of others, even larger organisms. The presence of numerous organisms is good and bad. The trout will often be rising for long periods of time to get enough organisms to fill their appetite and not be easy to put down. If put down, the trout may return to feeding in a relatively short period of time, depending in part on the river and how used to fishermen the trout have become. But your fly is just one of many organisms that the trout sees, so it may take many casts before the trout chooses your fly. During a sparse hatch, I'm fishing midges essentially in a searching mode with deep or mid-current midge pupa patterns. But what do I do when there are numerous midges with lots of rising fish? Let's see how some of our familiar rules of thumb may apply to midge hatches and whether they can help us choose the proper fly. The most recognizable hatches will be on quiet water, and midges, of course, are small. They, like blue-winged olives, may have trouble breaking through the surface tension, so there will often be many stillborns and cripples when fishing flat water. What stage or stages are the most numerous and vulnerable? Commonly, there are numerous pupae floating slowly towards the surface, and they become quickly concentrated in the surface film. So the surface pupae are likely the most numerous and are also very vulnerable. But some trout are commonly surface shy, and rising pupae are also numerous and quite vulnerable as they're rising only slowly. Additionally, stillborns and cripples may be quite numerous, especially on flat water, and are obviously very vulnerable. In other words, the trout may be taking midges at almost any level and multiple different patterns. Telling a quiet from an aggressive rise form, as you might see during a caddis hatch, is usually fairly easy, but also try to watch for the presence or absence of surface bubbles, which can theoretically help you choose the proper level to fish your flies. But remember that there may be trout taking rising pupa in mid-currents, and these would not cause a rise form. So, while these are valid rules of thumb and worth trying to apply even during a midge hatch, they don't help as much with midge hatches as with mayfly or caddis hatches. In flat water, trout, possibly individual trout, may be taking pupa patterns at any level, cripples or stillborns in the surface film, or a single or clustered adult on the surface. In faster or choppy water, even the normally surface midges may get washed under and be taken subsurface. So many possibilities exist. But what makes fishing midge hatches more manageable is that not uncommonly during a midge hatch, trout don't seem to become as selective to either the fly or the level of water column as with mayfly or caddis hatches. Perhaps different trout target different levels and stages. However, occasionally trout will become very selective to pattern and particularly to size and water level. When this happens, the fishing may be very challenging. So anyway, make your best choice of flies to start with and be willing to change as needed. Often you'll catch a few fish with each new change of fly and will need to keep changing flies to continue catching fish. While size seems very important, color only rarely seems important. I'll usually change flies after about 10 minutes of no success when there are lots of rising fish. What fly patterns do I choose to start with? If there's lots of rising fish, I'll usually start with a combination of the patterns listed. I would expect to catch most of my fish on the subsurface or surface pupa or the starling wrap. Likely I would use one of these as a dropper off the adult simple wrap, a foam post midge, or rarely a Griffith's gnat, any of which would also serve as my indicator fly. If the fish clearly show a preference, I'll switch to a single fly because I do enjoy fishing a single fly most of the time. If only a few or intermittent rising fish are present, I'll start with one of these patterns. If using the bead-headed zebra midge, I'll drop it off an elk hair caddis as my indicator fly. If it's getting dark so I can't see my fly, I'll also use a Tummel Fly on a slightly tight line so I can feel the strike. In faster or choppy water, I may start with any of the patterns mentioned, but I would likely rely mainly on the bead-headed zebra midge below an elk hair caddis as my indicator fly, or on the Tummel Fly. If it's getting dark so I can't see my fly, I would definitely use the Tummel Fly on a slightly tight line so I can feel the strike. If my original choices aren't working, I may try smaller flies, fishing a deeper level with a beadhead zebra midge, swinging a Tummel Fly, or putting on a classic Griffith's gnat, usually a size 20 to 26, although usually I really don't know why I choose one side over the other on any given day. Many midge fishermen start with the Griffith's gnat. Sometimes it's worked so well that I wondered why I didn't start with it in the first place. But some days my first choices seem to work better. My first choices look more like midges to me. So why is a Griffith's gnat so effective during a midge hatch? Does it look like a midge to you? Well, if we remember Hewitt's first factor of importance for imitation that we looked at in the Simple Entomology series, a Griffith's gnat should have many legs dimpling the surface, which, with some imagination, should look like a midge cluster. Look at the legs and surface dimples of this single midge. Now imagine the legs and dimplings that a midge cluster would make. And midges do commonly cluster, both during emergence and when mating. Midge clusters certainly provide more food value to a trout than a single midge. Maybe that's why a Griffith's gnat works so well. Maybe not. I can't really tell what fish are thinking, but a Griffith's gnat definitely does often work, so be sure to carry some with you. During heavy midge hatches on relatively flat water, I usually do better with quartering downstream casts or downstream casts with mends as we use for trico spinner falls, blue-winged olives, and others. In slightly faster water, which you'll sometimes be fishing also, the classic quartering upstream cast can be used. I'll usually start with a 3-foot tippet, correct for the size of hook, usually a 6X tippet, but I would be willing to go to a 7X on very flat water if needed. Usually my leader with tippet is no more than 10 to 12 feet combined, so I can still control it for accurate casts. Since I'm mainly fishing pupa, stillborns, and cripples, it makes sense to fish these dead drift, right? Well, yes and no. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's as simple as there are so many organisms present that a little motion draws the trout's attention to your fly. Or maybe the cripples and emerging adults quiver on the surface. But for whatever reason, a small movement of the soft-hackle Tummel Fly or starling rap seems to draw strikes often enough when the dead drift doesn't, that I commonly try a little movement after the dead drift method hasn't seemed to be working. Of course, some motion with the Griffith's gnat or an adult midge makes sense as midges and midge clusters scoot or get blown across the surface. Nevertheless, before changing patterns, try a little movement, especially with the Tummel soft hackle. But I do mean tiny movement. These are small insects. Since the opportunity to fish midges is common, lots of fun, and relatively simple, why do so many fishermen neglect fishing midges? I think there's two major reasons. The first is just psychological. Will trout really take such a small fly? Absolutely. But until you're comfortable with this fact, use the midge patterns as droppers off your favorite flies. Soon you'll be convinced. The other issue is a more practical issue, especially for us older fishermen. How do we get such small flies tied on? There's very little that's more frustrating than having trout rising all around you and not being able to get your fly tied on. Many manufacturers now make extra large eye versions of their smaller hooks. Use them. Don't crowd the hook eye when tying. Always put on a small thread head to keep materials out of the hook eye. Use 2 3-wrap whip finishes and skip the head to cement. Sometimes the hook eye will have varnish or some other coating that manufacturers put on to prevent rusting. So clean the eye before removing it from your vise. I use bifocal sunglasses, but these are often too dark in the evening, so I keep cheap 3X reading glasses on the lanyard around my neck. I find this better than most of the other optical aids out there. My sunglasses are on a shorter lanyard, so switching glasses to tie on a fly is easy. I just let one set of glasses dangle while I'm using the other. I have a dedicated midge box, and I usually keep some commonly used midge patterns preloaded on threaders. But I also carry a device that I made with one of these midge threaders inside. I carry it around my neck, so when I want to use a midge pattern that is not preloaded, I can use this. Many threaders are available that work for larger hooks, in other words, the ones that you don't really need a threader for, but this is the threader that has worked best for me for midges. I don't like to mention brand names, and perhaps similar threaders may be made by several companies. In my device, the actual threader is on a pivot inside a wood slot, so the wire is protected while I wear it around my neck. It pivots open to 90 degrees to use, so I can easily thread a fly on it, even if I accidentally had crowded the eye while tying. I can then let the device with the fly dangle from my neck as I grab my tippet. I then push the tippet through the wide opening of the threader and pull the fly off the threader. Ultimately releasing the tag end of the tippet, I push it back slightly from the tip of the threader and then pull the tippet tag end out of the threader. Tie the fly on in the usual fashion. I use a Pitson knot, which I would recommend as it's a small, strong knot. I leave the tag long enough to include the kink from the threader so that the kink gets cut off. This threader works well even for very small sizes in 6X tippet or thinner tippet. I don't need to use the threader very often, but it has saved my sanity multiple times. It is worth practicing a little at home before you get on the stream in the middle of a hatch. In summary, many fishermen neglect fishing midges. You should not be one of these. Midge hatches are common, long-lasting, and if you've tied your flies small enough, fishing a midge hatch is not only great fun, but sometimes surprisingly easy. Just be sure to cast and wade carefully so that you don't scare the trout. Trout must eat numerous midges, so you have lots of chances to show the trout your fly. Often an exact imitation is not needed, but it is usually best to show the trout something about the same size. So make sure you get out there and fish midges this year. You'll be glad you did. Well, we've covered most of the hatches I've fished and extrapolated to cover most of the common hatches you're likely to fish. We still have a few miscellaneous hatches to cover quickly and some final comments for this series. I'm Raj Kletke, and I'll see you soon.